Hello, fellow Americans and non-Americans, to our 5-minute Bible study. Today we are discussing 2 Samuel chapter 12. We are continuing the story, the not-so-happy story of David and Bathsheba. Going to see God's response in this chapter. As always, let's jump to our PDF handout. Voila! You can download this on our website for free if you want it. As always, again, let's start with our timeline section, or when section. When did these events happen in biblical history? Well, David became king around 1055 BC and reigned for 40 years. So this story obviously happens within his time as king. In terms of our characters, we have David, we have Uriah and Bathsheba, who we were introduced to in the last chapter. David actually killed Uriah in the last chapter so that he could take his wife, Bathsheba, because he accidentally got her pregnant during an affair. We're going to talk about Joab, who was the commander of the Israelite army, and finally Nathan. Nathan is a prophet of God. God sent Nathan to confront David about his sins with Bathsheba. Now to our map. The locations remain the same from last chapter. David's house was at Jerusalem, and that's where he got involved with Bathsheba. Joab and the Israelite army were not there. They were off fighting David's battles. They were fighting the Ammonites at Rabbah. After Rabbah, they ended up conquering all the cities of the Ammonites, and you can see the territory of Ammon, the general location, on the map on the right side of the Dead Sea and the Jordan River. This chapter is chock full of information, so I'll try to be as swift as possible as we go through our outline. Our first section is verses 1 through 6. Nathan's parable about the little ewe lamb. Are you ready? Brace your emotions for this story. God sent the prophet Nathan to David, and he told him a story. 2 men lived in the same city. One was a rich man and one was a poor man. Now, the rich man, obviously, he had lots and lots of livestock. He had lots and lots of sheep. But the poor man only had one little ewe lamb that he loved very much. One day, guests came to visit the rich man, and instead of butchering one of his own sheep, he took the little ewe lamb from the poor man and he cooked it for his guests. Yes, that's a terrible thing to do. And David thought the same thing. After hearing the story, David was really angry. And he said this, quote, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die." Section number 2, verses 7 through 14, Nathan condemns David's sin with Bathsheba. Nathan, having heard the king's condemnation of this man who had done this terrible thing, stolen his neighbor's sheep, Nathan looked at David and he said, "You are the man." Nathan reminded David how God had made him king, given him riches, given him many wives. And yet David thought that it was acceptable to murder one of his own loyal servants who seems like only had one wife, Uriah, who was married to Bathsheba. Right? So David had done exactly as the rich man had done to the poor man who had the little ewe lamb. He had killed Uriah. He had taken the only thing that belonged to him. Nathan announced a series of curses that would fall on David's house because of his evil. Number 1, the sword would never depart from David's house. His family would constantly be engaged in fighting, and we'll read about that in the upcoming chapters. Number 2, other men would have relations with David's wives. Not only that, but it would be known publicly throughout Israel that this was taking place. We'll read about that later on in the text. And number 3, the child that Bathsheba was pregnant with due to this affair between David and Bathsheba, that child was going to die. And to David's credit, he didn't argue, he acknowledged his sin, and he accepted his punishment. Section number 3, verses 15 through 23, the child of David and Bathsheba dies, just as the prophet told them. When Bathsheba gave birth, the child that she gave birth to became very sick. David fasted, and he prayed to the Lord for the child to live, thinking God might change his mind. But God would not withdraw his judgment, and the baby died on the 7th day. David accepted the Lord's decision. He got up, he anointed himself, and he went into the house of the Lord to worship. Next section is just 2 verses. A very important person in Israelite history is going to be born, and that is Solomon, verses 24 and 25. So after the original child died, another son was born to David and Bathsheba. They named him Solomon, but Nathan the prophet actually gave him another name. He called him Jedediah. And then finally, 26 through 31, the end of the chapter, David and Joab conquer Rabbah, which was this place where Joab and the army had been fighting during this whole affair. Joab was fighting the Ammonites at Rabbah, as was mentioned in chapter 11, verse 1. Realizing that the city was about to fall, he invited David to the battlefield so that David could receive credit for the victory. David went to Rabbah, conquered the city, and took the crown of their king, and the Ammonites became the servants of the Israelites. And now finally, for our application section. A great man is going to make mistakes. Part of being a great man is the way that you respond to your mistakes and responding to them in a positive way. We see that in David. David provides us with a good example of how we ought to respond when we get caught in sin. When confronted, he didn't make excuses. He didn't try to justify himself. He didn't lash out in anger at Nathan. He humbled himself. He acknowledged that he had made a mistake. He accepted that there would be consequences for that mistake, and he did his best to get his life back on track after God's mercy had been extended to him. And that's a pattern for our lives whenever we get caught up in some kind of sin.